Hi, I'm Dave Boling, author of the novel Guernica. I'd like to thank the New York City Basque Club for the invitation to do a video book club presentation for an historic occasion. April 26 will mark the 75th anniversary of the Nazi bombing of the village of Guernica. Accurate casualty figures will never be known, but the attack stands as one of the tragic acts of the 20th century. For nearly 4 hours, the Nazi Condor Legion bombed the Basque capital, although it had no military or strategic value. Franco specifically hated the Basque because he knew them to be the most fierce anti-fascist fighters. He promised to destroy the Basque at all costs, and he invited his friend Adolf Hitler to use the Basque country as a test run for the bombing tactics he would use later in World War II. In the aftermath, Pablo Picasso painted his iconic mural Guernica, and the name of the village itself came to be a symbol of acts of senseless violence against civilians. More than 30 years ago, I met and married a young lady of Basque descent. And from her family, I learned of the Basque culture and heritage and their foods and wines and dances and character and their fierce pride in their country and their devotion to their families. And in the process, I also learned from them the history of the bombing of Guernica. And that's why I was so surprised after 9/11 that no one traced back the history of these acts of terrorism to the bombing of Guernica that day in Spain in 1937. Now, I'd been a newspaper journalist, and through the years I'd learned to write a bit, and I decided I should maybe branch out and try historical fiction specifically with the idea of taking a renewed look at the bombing and making it the setting of a piece of fiction. Within my first day of researching, I came upon a historical fact that truly inspired me. There were very few doctors and nurses in the village, of course. There were fewer than 5,000 residents. And consequently, nuns jumped in to help the few doctors, in makeshift hospitals that were set up in the convents. Now, they saw the kinds of injuries that one would expect after such an attack. Shrapnel bullets, burns, victims who had buildings collapse on them. But they also saw a curious number of victims brought in with mangled hands. Doctors were at a loss to explain it. They learned that these people were so intent on digging through jagged rubble to try to find their loved ones that they tore the flesh and meat right off their fingers. Now, it gave me chills when I read that, and it gives me chills today whenever I talk about it. I had read thousands of books, but I had never come across anything that I thought so perfectly showed an example of what great love is for someone, that you would be so driven to save them that you would not even know that your hands were being torn apart. Until I read that, I thought it would be a good idea to write about the bombing of Guernica. But once I read it, I realized it started to feel like an obligation to tell the story of these very brave people. I knew, of course, that it would involve an account of the bombing, but that couldn't be the whole story. Nobody could stand that trauma to read that for several hundred pages. So I needed to build a story about typical Basque families of the era, that I could help readers understand who these people were and to get to know these characters that I hoped would capture the qualities of the Basque people that I knew to be very fun-loving and hard-working, with close-knit families, dedicated to their land and the preservation of their heritage. So I spent considerable time in the Basque country on both sides of the Pyrenees doing interviews and researching sites and trying to get a sense of the place as well as the people. In Guernica, I went to the market, and I tried to imagine it that day. And I listened to the people as they talked and what would be the typical conversations on a Monday afternoon in the market. The Basque of Guernica are to be applauded that they don't traffic in their grief or their history. There is a beautiful peace museum there, and on one wall is a mosaic likeness of Picasso's mural. But other than that, there are very few things there are certainly no historical markers or any way that they try to bring tourists to capitalize on the tragedy that they lived through. But on one street, a stone column stands right off a sidewalk, and it's the remnant of a building that obviously had been destroyed. And again, there are no signs or anything, to point it out. But as you walk down the sidewalk, it's a stone column, a little bit larger than the size of a person, but in a similar shape. And the stones are riddled from many dozen bullet holes, several inches deep into the solid rock. And it just stands there with its meaning obvious to anyone who walks past. It's very moving. Went out to farmland outside Guernica, and just spent time watching people work the fields, watching baby donkeys in the paddock, watching them run around their mothers, and that turned into a scene in the book that helped establish the pastoral sense, the peaceful lifestyle that these people were living before incomprehensible terror came from the skies. In Acacio, one morning I went to the 4 a.m. daily mass with the fishermen, and I watched them file out to their boats in the dark and prepare for their day at the sea, and that too turned into a scene for the book. I spent a week hiking the smugglers' trails across the Pyrenees, following the path of the Basque resistance fighters who sneaked down Allied flyers back into neutral Spain. That also became an important part of the last segment of the book. And of course I did a great deal of library and online research as well. And I spent about 1.5 years writing the book and sent copies of the early drafts to Spanish Civil War historians and Basque historians and scholars to look through to help make sure that we were getting this exactly right. And once it hit the market, I was very fortunate to get an agent quickly and a publisher quickly, and it sold around the world and has been translated into 15 languages. And I really have no delusions that it has to do with my ability as a great author, but I think much more it resonates the importance of the topic and the appeal of these characters. There's been so many rewarding aspects to this, and it's so many of them. It's wonderful to speak to book clubs and get to know people, but really I have to say that when I was brought to Spain by my Spanish publisher for a tour of events, it was really some of the most rewarding moments. Particularly the first event we had was in Madrid at the Euskal, pardon my pronunciation, but at the Basque House there. And the first person I met was a man who worked as a clerk, and he was right there at a desk when I came in with my interpreter. And he apparently recognized me from the picture on the book jacket, and he came up, and he was so serious, and he had his book, and he held it in both hands, and he held it toward me, and he spoke through the interpreter, and he said, "My mother was there that day. She lost her sister that day." And he held it toward me. He said, this book is a tribute to them. Well, he started crying, and I started crying, and the interpreter started crying, and we all hugged. And, at that moment I decided that that was the best review I could possibly get. If that's that was value enough to write the book. So I've been fortunate enough to hear from readers around the world who say that the book has helped them learn about the history of the Spanish Civil War, the horror of the bombing, but mostly they seem to appreciate learning about the Basque and their culture. And a number of them, in fact, have told me that they've gone on vacations in the Basque Country and visited places that I've mentioned in the book. For me, the experience has been amazing. I truly never turned down a chance to talk about the book at book clubs or events, because a huge part of it is that I hope I can keep alive the awareness of this tragic piece of history. And I thank you for asking me to visit with you. I'm happy to do so, and I hope I like to tell people that I have a hard time saying I hope you enjoyed the book, because it is painful in spots, but it's more a story about the Basque family and their loves and their courage and resilience that they showed in these difficult times. So, thank you very much. Eskerrik asko. Bye now.